Doctors of Reddit. What was your how the FCK did you survive that moment? Ington year doing surgery. Guy gets brought in for a gunshot wound to the head. He was working at a jeweler that got robbed. His co-worker was black bagged at the scene. He gets brought into the trauma bay and it's pretty hectic because GSW to the head and well he's alive. Not only is he alive, he's following commands but not speaking. Probably from the shock. Cops are giving us reports saying he was likely shot with a .357 snub nose they recovered at the scene. So we do our primary and secondary survey and all this guy has is a single wood wound to his left frontal scalp where the bullet went in. So the team hasn't really seen something like this before. Sure, a GSW to the head wasn't new, but this guy was otherwise completely fine. The decision was made to get a quick frontal and late head x-ray to verify where the bullet was before proceeding to CT. Well, we don't see any bullet on the films. There's no bullet on the board or bed or within the patient's clothes. The man was shot in the head and the bullet bounced off his skull. CT showed no fracture even. It was wild. Never seen anything like that since. So a common question I'm getting is, how do we know it was a GSW? He had gunpowder burns on his forehead around the wound. Not a doctor yet, but I worked in a trauma center as a scribe before starting med school. Basically, I was attached at the hip with a doctor to do their documentation. One guy wrecked his car into a wooden fence, and a wooden fence post went in his mouth and came out the back of his neck. It was the kind of fence post that was double the size of his mouth. It had basically pushed all of the important anatomy to the side as it impaled him. There were consulting doctors for like 10 different specialties working on this guy in the hospital. Several weeks later, after he fully recovered, he walked back in the emergency department to thank everyone. I was working in the emergency department when a toddler came in after falling out of a 3-story window completely unharmed. The sad thing was they were from a rough neighborhood and the mum hadn't noticed for about half an hour. Apparently the friendly apartment pot smokers found him, checked him over and sat with him for half an hour, and when mum didn't show up went to find her. The child was admitted overnight mostly for social reasons, but it's just amazing how well kids bounce. Emergency nurse. Once had a guy come in who had been cutting a tree with a chainsaw when it hit a knot in the wood and kicked up into his neck. Finished cutting the tree because he knew his wife would make him get rid of the chainsaw. Put a towel on it and drove himself to the hospital. CT showed no vascular damage. Simple washout and home the next day. One of the paramedics who saw him said to his patient, "That's a real emergency. Why don't we ever get those?" Edit. Location Australia, Queensland. I was a surgical resident in a small town hospital. We got paged to see a patient for a speared piece of driftwood through the leg. We were thinking it was a nicked femoral artery and discussing if this poor kid needed amputation. When we saw him, he was standing on the skewered leg taking a piss. Turns out the wood missed every single one of the vital vessels and no fracture, just muscular damage. Not a doctor. My dad, who is one, told me this story once. He has this 12-year-old patient, let's call him Tim, and everyone in the hospital firmly believes he's immortal. Tim was born with a bad heart and is constantly in and out of the ICU. By in and out of the ICU, he goes in almost once or twice a month. 9 out of 10 admissions, Tim flatlines. Strangely, Tim always comes back, even if you don't resuscitate him. I'd say Tim flatlined about 15ish times in total. It's at the point that whenever Tim flatlines, nobody panics. Not even his mom, and the first 3 times she fell on the floor crying. Hey guys, Tim's vitals are dropping. Again? Whew. That kid's definitely going for a record. Tim's pretty chill about it too. He talks about his IQ trips like how a normal kid talks about a mildly eventful day at school. Nobody knows how TF does Tim always come back. He just does. Frankly, I'm surprised the media hasn't done a story about it. BC, it's ducking metal. Every time I think this question, the answer is usually meth. One guy got hit in the face hard enough to let air into his brain cavity and was being an absolute asshole, which seemed to be normal for him, and literally asked, "Got any meth?" When I offered some pain relief, to my understanding, he recovered without any need for surgery. Not a doctor yet, but during one of my night shifts as a medical student, I had to take in charge a patient who came to the ER for a walker accident. Well, That's quite common. What is not is that he came by himself from 40 kms by calling a taxi because his car was absolutely wrecked in the accident. Normally, when your car ends up upside down after 2 or 3 rollovers at 60 km/h, which the patient did, you are not really fine. However, he was totally okay. No broken bone, no head trauma, no abdominal pain, nothing. He just came to the ER because he had little dermabrasions over his knees and one elbow, and it hurts when it rubs against my cloth, sir. 3 band-aids later, and he was good to go. Not a doctor but paramedic. Once went a car wreck where a drunk drove headfirst into the corner of a brick bridge at 100 mph. Took a huge wedge out of the bottom of the bridge and left the car about 1/4 of its normal length. All the impact was on the driver's side. Turned up only 2 minutes after the crash and fully expected it to be a fatality. Walked round to the driver's side and somehow he was fully conscious but squeezed into the only space left in the car. Took almost 3 hours to get him out, and on extracting him out he had absolutely nothing wrong with him other than being a pissed up asshole. Still think how the duck did he survive that. Junior doc on the trauma team. Does Teresa's fly open to reveal a man carrying a second blood-soaked man in his arms. Get him onto a stretcher and it is clear he has gunshot wound to his chest and has gone into cardiac arrest. Asystole. Chest compressions start and within minutes the arm consultant is performing an open thoracotomy in order to start cardiac massage. Cardiothoracics join us quickly and get to work on the heart. A hole in the right ventricle is identified and plugged with a Foley catheter. All the while bag after bag of O-neg is being pushed into the patient in an attempt to replace everything that had pumped out of his heart and into his thoracic cavity. 15-20 mins into this the impossible happens. We get our OSE. The heart starts beating in its own. Patient is taken directly to theater where the hole is definitively repaired and bilateral chest drains are inserted to drain the blood filling his lungs. Technically the pleural space. Somehow his heart continued beating and after a couple weeks on ITU, the patient is returned to the trauma ward awake and alert. Several weeks, some mild hypoxic brain injury, and a gnarly chest scar later and he walks off the ward with his dad, the man who carried him in. Eat a definition of our OSC. I hope I never ducking see this again. Just finished a 24-hour call so I'll paraphrase. I'm an Abjin resident. 300 pounds African American female with IVF twins around 32 weeks gestation. Multiple medical problems. Chronic hypertension. Being monitored inpatient. AMM rounds she looks uncomfortable. Said she slept in a chair. Just looked very anxious for no reason. Breathing heavy. Blood pressure is very high. We give meds. We can only get one twin's heart. Probably because she's so big. We move her to land for closer monitoring. Plus ready access to ultrasound. Now she has a lot of abdominal pain. Blood pressure still very high. Her breathing is getting heavier. Stat chest x-ray shows her lungs are like completely whited out, filling with fluid from flash pulmonary edema. At the same time her abdominal pain is worse and worse. Big bright red clot falls out of her V. Same time. We get an ultrasound view of both fetuses. Twin 2's heart is super slow. Patient is now having a panic attack and screaming while also having V trouble breathing. This is all within like 10 minutes. Stat emergency crash C-section. Get her on the table. She starts having an eclamptic seizure. Anesthesia does rapid sequence intubation. Loud. Long. Steady. Beep. Patient goes into cardiac arrest on the table. Code blue. Labor and delivery goes out overhead throughout the hospital. Phones all over the floor start blowing up. White coats and scrubs sprinting onto the floor. ICU comes running. Rapid response team comes running. General surgery comes running. A double NICU team comes running. There's like 30 people in the OR. ICU is giving chest compressions and running the code. Surgery is putting in a central line. Rapid response is setting up to shock. Obgyn is doing the C-section. Remember the attending yell, cut, cut, cut. Obgyn goes skin to baby number 1 in about 54 seconds. There's blood everywhere. Compressions still going while operating. Second baby comes out very still looking. Placental abruption. The high blood pressure flooded her lungs and tore the placenta off the uterus. NICU takes both babies. They eventually do just fine as far as hospital course goes. Mom achieves ROSE, return of spontaneous circulation. Her heart is beating on its own now. Still bleeding. Massive transfusion protocol initiated. She eventually gets somewhere between 14 and 20 units of packed red blood cells plus plasma, platelets, other stuff. Thank you for giving blood. It actually actively saves the lives of people who wish they could know who to thank. Conservative surgical measures don't stop the bleeding. Calvulaire uterus is diagnosed secondary to placental abruption in the setting of a clamtic seizure. Caesarean hysterectomy is performed. Uterus comes out. Patient remains intubated for about 2 days. Downgraded from SICU. Walks out of the goddamn hospital after 1 week because that's how a solid medical team handles their it. Now, there were a lot of red flags to indicate delivery at the beginning of this story, but she spiraled so fast. There really wasn't any significant wasted time. Not a doctor, but a fellow worker took a 35-pound steel plate being propelled by 3,770 C, equivalent to 188.5 car tires, to the face, sent him 15 feet in the air, and 40 feet back, broke every bone in his face, lived and back to work 8 months later. Edit. My math with car tires is awful. I meant to try and put it in terms I thought Redditors may understand. Also, till car tires optimal C rating is 30-35. It was 26 MPa, 5,500 meters hull with 2 7/8 tubing, on a 6.5 inches cased hull, with roughly 300-350 feet of 3 inches flow line to a 3 inches 10,000 C rated manifold. It's a lot of pressure. Not a doctor, but a friend's story. He'd been feeling like it for a long time. Went to the doctor. Doctor ordered a bunch of blood tests, and ordered them on a rush basis. The lab calls the doctor to itch him out. Why the duck did you make us rush these tests? Doctor is confused. Lab is like, the guy is clearly dead. So what's the ducking rush? Doctor calls him. Tells him to not drive but to get himself to emergency ASAP. Guy was a type 1 diabetic. Hadn't realized it until way later in life. And apparently his blood work suggested he was a corpse rather than a living person. He's still doing fine. First year of my core surgical training, I was on call in a very small rural hospital. This hospital only had 2 doctors on at night. Me and a medical trainee. And no emergency doctors. It's about 11 PM and this guy, 26, comes in after being in a fight. Blood pumping from his nose which was clearly fractured. I suspected he probably had other facial fractures underneath, but he was awake and talking to me. Otherwise seemed fine. I spent about 45 minutes trying to stop the blood, using all sorts of nose packs, pressure, even tried a catheter balloon to try and tamponade it. Nothing was working. And he was starting to go into shock. And I was basically eating myself at this stage. Based on his vitals, I'd estimated he'd lost almost 1.5 liters of blood so far. Nearest proper surgical hospital was 45 minutes away, and my consultant was at home, 25 minutes from the hospital. Eventually I got 4 bags of oneg from the lab. The lab tech happened to be in, which was very lucky. Put this guy in the back of an ambulance, still bleeding, and sent him blue light to the surgical center in the city. Got a phone call about 3 hours later from a surgeon at the other hospital, saying he had brought the patient to theater and been able to control the situation. He was probably 15 minutes from dead. If you come into that kind of small hospital with that much bleeding, all stats say you're in trouble. The guy was very lucky his friends got him in so quickly. A doctor asked me this. I was asleep in the back of a pickup on the way back from a rugby tournament one night and we had a head-on with a drunk driver. I went through the back of the cab, through the windscreen, hit and bounced off the other car and ended up maybe 20 meters from the accident. Multiple broken bones, compressed vertebrae, internal and head injuries. After multiple surgeries and a year in hospital, I walked out. At the first checkup, the surgeon, who I knew really well by then, said exactly that. So seriously, how the duck did you survive that? My unvoiced response was, sometimes I wish I hadn't. I was the lucky one. An elderly lady had a massive brain hemorrhage. Was transferred to terminal care to the health center inpatient ward I was working at as the doctor. Her prognosis was that she would die at any moment. There was no treatment. She was comatose, but breathing spontaneously through a tracheotomy tube. A week passed, with no medications, no food, no fluids, still alive. Then she began to stir, came conscious, delirious, but conscious. So we started IV, fluids, appropriate medications, and eventually physiotherapy. After a few months she moved into the local nursing home, lived for a few years. She had profound dementia, but was able to move. I wonder if the air moisturizing device in the room, because of the tracheotomy, kept her hydrated, because a healthy person would generally not survive a week without fluids. Patient, not as cool as most of these, but I was puking for 3 days straight before going into urgent care. I wasn't even going to go in, but my family said I looked awful and I eventually relented. They said I had appendicitis. Due to a mix-up I didn't get operated on for over a day later, and they went in. My appendix was gangrenous and had basically disintegrated. Turns out it had burst ruptured days ago. Normally, this floods your body with toxins and you die, but apparently my colon was positioned in such a way that it blocked that from happening. I was in the hospital for another week before my digestive system restarted and had to have bile pumped out of my stomach. All in all though, not a terrible experience. I am not a doctor, but when I was around 23 I was stubborn and didn't go to the doctors for feeling weak and numb all the time with some blackouts. I brushed it off until I literally couldn't get up to walk to the bathroom, thinking it was just a cold or flu. When I finally made it to the ER my blood count was at 3. Regular is around 14. Doctor said he didn't know how I was alive still. Not a doctor, but I'm a firefighter, so I see my fair share of trauma. About a year ago, we responded to a call that went out as an individual who had a car fall on his face. He was hotboxing in his garage while working underneath his car that was supported by scissor jacks. Something to note, the car didn't have any tires on the front end where he was working. One of the scissor jacks had slipped out from underneath the car, and the whole weight of the car landed directly onto the side of his head with no tires to stop the fall. We got our rubber airbags out, lifted the car, pulled him out, and got him onto a stretcher. After taking 2,500 pounds of weight to the head, he somehow got out of it with a fractured orbital and a laceration on his cheek. Early years in medical school I saw a surgery of a policeman who was shot in head in a gunfight. The bullet went through his skull and brain. With my experience in games and movies I always assumed a headshot is instant death, but that man survived it and I was in shock how this can happen. Turns out in many cases a headshot can be survived. Sorry for my English is not good. Not a doctor, but a patient. My husband took me to the local hospital's ED for ongoing severe lower abdominal pain. I figured uterus. The nurses took blood, hooked me up to an IV, and gave me a little pain medicine. A nurse I hadn't yet seen came into the ED room looking very nervous and told me I was being admitted as my platelet count was 6,000. My husband and I were like, what? Nurse was very surprised I had no symptoms like bruising, nosebleeds, and blood in urine or stool. He looked very concerned and the medical team rushed to get me into a room. The only symptoms I had were fatigue and heavy menstrual flow. Both symptoms had been my companions since I started my period at 11 years old. The next morning a hematologist came to my room and explained my diagnosis and that it was entirely idiopathic. He told me I was lucky to not have had crazy internal bleeding into my brain or a stroke. He prescribed a regimen of 60 mg of prednisone daily, which I was on for a year and a half. Not recommended. It was awful. The idiopathic thrombocytopenia made no progress. It was finally decided to proceed with a splenectomy. Recovery was brutal. Having a huge incision down the length of your abdomen makes everyday tasks very difficult and painful. Almost 5 years later, my platelet count is normal. My period can go to hell in a handbasket, though. Obligatory, not a DR. Ex-nurse though. This happened to my gran-in-law. She was in her early 80s, on blood thinners and took a nasty fall and hit her head. Quite a common injury unfortunately, and she was admitted to hospital. The amazing part is that for 3 days her condition worsened and the signs that she had a brain hemorrhage went unnoticed. That is until she became unresponsive. Then we had all the bells and whistles. She was airlifted to a larger hospital and I spent the day preparing my family for the worst. The bleeding had gone unchecked for a long time, and if she did survive, prepare for her to be different. That Wonder Woman woke up a few hours after surgery with zero impairment, memory intact right up to hospital admission. It was an amazing recovery that we're all very grateful for. Not a doctor, so sorry, but I'll contribute. I will never ever forget a guy coming into the emergency ward with a ducking serrated combat knife sticking directly out of the top of his head. He was walking himself in. To this day I cannot comprehend that. Emergency physician. I had a patient that was shot 9 times. 3 bullets to the head. He didn't call an ambulance. He brought himself to the emergency department. And by that I mean he drove himself to the emergency department. The 3 bullets in his head somehow didn't enter the cranium, so his brain was just fine. One of them entered his cheek and went underneath the skin to swing all the way around to the back of his head. He was discharged the same day. I had a patient that attempted suicide with an AR-15 under the chin. Put a hole in the soft tissues of the floor of his mouth, in his tongue, in his hard palate, and then split the hemispheres of his brain perfectly, finally popping out the top of his skull. He recovered fully. I had a rare type of ovarian cancer called teratoma. They were bilateral and massive, which is even more rare. When I was diagnosed, all they could see on the imaging was masses with various densities. Lots of inflammation and adhesions everywhere. Everyone was trying to be optimistic to my face, but I could tell it was really bad. They told me they couldn't give me a realistic scenario until after the surgery. They said they needed to go in and take out anything and everything the tumors were involved in. I was 35 at the time and said, if it's that bad, just sew me up and that's it. I didn't want chemo and radiation and no kidneys, bladder or intestines. When I was put under, there was a team of about 20 people there. Every type of specialist, oncologists, surgeons you could imagine. Pathologists to do all the slides and the even. Everyone looked at me like I was already dead. I asked for a Valium and went under. When I woke up I hurt really bad but felt better. It was so odd. Like I had the flu and it was just gone all of a sudden. I looked around and all the nurses and doctors were there. Some of them had obviously been crying, but they looked happy. I was doped obviously and was struggling to put 2 and 2 together. Then I really opened my eyes and someone started clapping and they all wanted to hold my hand. I was like, okay, I'm actually dead. The main surgeon was choking tears back and said to me that it was all going to be okay. She explained to me I had massive teratomas and we had caught them still in the benign stage, but they had been adhered to stuff, which is why the scans looked like my abdomen was riddled with cancer. She started crying really hard and laughing at the same time and said, you're going to be totally okay pending the final pathology on all the lymph nodes. The nurse told me later when they opened me up and figured out what it was, a cheer went up in the air. Lol, I had a radical hysterectomy and was supposed to be in the hospital for 4 days. 5 hours after surgery I told them to pull the urinary catheter and had them help me up. I refused to use the bathroom in my room and insisted I walk myself to the toilet at the end of the hall every time I had to go. I was discharged the very next afternoon and never looked back. That is about as close as I ever want to come to dying until I actually die. I'm living the very best life I can now. Sold everything he owned and moved the horses and my truck to Scotland. I'm getting my doctorate and dealing with all the demons in my life. The amount of power I have now is incredible and the world seems more vibrant. Hard to explain, but a lot of the fears I had are gone now. It seems a lot like what the astronauts get. When your perspective becomes vast and you realize the world is a small speck in the universe and you get a profound sense of the world's humanity. The only downside is that sometimes it makes normal stuff seem totally trivial. Lol. Price I will gladly pay to see the forest instead of just the trees. I was very vocal about what happened to me after and encouraged people to go get their yearly exams. As a result, 2 people I know went to their exams and the docs caught cervical cancer early. They are both doing great now. Men and women, please learn from me. Go to the doctor for your yearly exams. Don't wait. Don't be shy. If you think something is up, then just go. Your pride isn't worth your life. 1 in 10 women you know will have ovarian cancer. Don't wait. Go get your exams. Oh yeah. Best joke ever. I snuck the surgical skin marker and wrote insert superpowers here across my chest with an arrow pointing down to my abdomen. LMAO. I think it made them all even happier when everything turned out okay. Edit. Spelling. I'm a researcher rather than a doctor, but during my undergrad my anatomy tutor told us of an interesting case study. A woman in the same department had been in a car accident going a considerable speed. The seatbelt failed to lock and her face flew into the steering wheel. Her mouth, nose, cheekbones and forehead were shattered, yet she suffered no brain damage. Apparently, the front of her face acted as a crumple zone and the fact her skull shattered meant the cranial swelling didn't cause any damage because the brain had more space to swell into. She needed significant reconstructive surgery, but a year later she and my tutor teamed up in a research project. They used her case as the basis for looking into new ways to treat severe head injuries and developed new treatment protocols depending on where the skull had taken damage. They basically found out that if you're going to have a head injury, try and get hit in the face and not the temples because you're much more likely to survive. Not a doctor, a family friend. As a teen, my friend's son had all sorts of bladder and kidney infections. The doctors could not figure out what was causing them. Finally they did the scan of his whole abdomen to try to see what was going on, if there was an obstruction or something else going on. Turns out he inserted a long wire up his D. He said it felt good. He lost his grip on the wire when it was almost all the way in and he couldn't figure out how to remove it. He didn't tell a doctor or anyone because he was embarrassed and thought he would get yelled at. He did a lot of damage up there, mostly due to infections. Not a doctor. This is a story about my dad's best friend, or as he's more commonly known, the human kebab. So this guy decides to take his dogs out on a walk on a particularly cold Scotland morning and on his way out slips on some ice. Unfortunately he landed on a metal pole that was being used to hold up flowers or something. Anyway this pole goes in through his side just under the ribcage I believe and exits through his neck. After being rushed to the hospital and had x-rays and whatever done the doctors concluded that the pole had missed all vital organs, veins and arteries and they basically just had to pull it out. This all happened many years before I was born but it still absolutely blows my mind. A patient in his late 90s was admitted to our hospice for terminal care, i.e. to die, because of untreatable multi-level bowel obstruction, confirmed on CT scan, and clinically obvious from his swollen abdomen and profuse vomiting. The guy was, however, absolutely charming and completely at peace with this. He did want discomfort, and felt he had had a good life. He was scared to eat because of the vomiting it caused. If your bowel is blocked then any eating has to go back out the way it came in. Otherwise he was comfy enough with just a little pain relief. He was also lovely to chat to, very reflective and articulate in his speech and mannerisms. He had been told he had days, possibly hours, to live by the surgeons at the local hospital, and he barely drank anything, and ate literally nothing. This continued for 2 months. And though he lost a tremendous amount of weight and physical capability it seemed that during this time his bowel obstruction had spontaneously unobstructed. We ended up getting him home. The sad thing is, however, he had completely come to terms with his death. He is now still petrified of eating and believes super strongly that his bowel is going to obstruct again, which it may. He just doesn't ever want to go through that experience again and I do sometimes wonder if he would have been better off dying peacefully with a sire.